Imagine standing in the middle of a construction site in West Africa, when suddenly the ground beneath a bulldozer gives way, and the massive machine tumbles into darkness, disappearing into a hole that shouldn't exist, revealing something that had been hidden for over 300 years, something that would rewrite our understanding of African military ingenuity and challenge everything historians thought they knew about resistance, survival, and the art of disappearing in plain sight. This isn't the opening to a fantasy novel or an adventure film. This is exactly what happened on an ordinary day in February 1998 near the city of Boikan in the Republic of Benin, when workers from the Danish construction company Danida were building a road and accidentally discovered one of Africa's most extraordinary secrets. A vast underground city capable of sheltering thousands of warriors, complete with bedrooms, kitchens, wells, and interconnected passages that stretched across 17 acres beneath the earth, all carved out by hand in the 17th century by a kingdom that had learned the most important lesson of warfare. Sometimes the greatest power doesn't come from standing your ground, but from knowing exactly when and how to vanish. The underground town of Ogongionto Zungudo sits approximately 9 kilometers from Abomey, which was once the beating heart of one of West Africa's most formidable kingdoms, the Kingdom of Dahomey, a state that would become legendary for its military prowess, its fearsome all-female warrior regiment known as the Agoji, or Dahomey Amazons, its complex political systems, and its ability to survive in one of the most contested regions of pre-colonial Africa, where empires rose and fell with the seasons, and where survival meant constant adaptation, negotiation, and, when necessary, the willingness to wage war without mercy. The discovery in 1998 revealed over 50 underground dwellings, each one a masterpiece of subterranean architecture, carved approximately 10 meters below the surface, deep enough to provide protection, but shallow enough to allow for rapid deployment. And what makes these structures truly remarkable isn't just their size or their number, but their sophistication, the way they were designed with multiple levels in some cases, the presence of wells that provided fresh water even during sieges, the careful segmentation of spaces into living quarters, cooking areas, and storage chambers, suggesting that this wasn't just a temporary hiding place, but a fully functional underground settlement where warriors could live for extended periods, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But to understand why anyone would undertake the monumental task of building an entire city underground, you have to understand the world that created this necessity. And that means going back to the 17th century, when the Abomey Plateau, where these tunnels were built, was a dangerous place to exist, caught between powerful neighbors who could crush any small state that showed weakness. And the story begins with King Dakodonu, the second king of what would become Dahomey, who ruled in the late 1600s and who faced a problem that would define his reign and shape the destiny of his people. How do you defend a small kingdom when you're surrounded by enemies with superior numbers and more advanced military technology? To the east loomed the mighty Oyo Empire, a Yoruba kingdom that at its peak commanded a cavalry force exceeding 100,000 horsemen, warriors mounted on horses imported at expense from the north, animals that, despite their vulnerability to the tsetse fly and the challenges of the rainy season, represented the most devastating military technology of the age in this region, capable of sweeping across the savannah and crushing infantry forces before they could organize any meaningful resistance. The Oyo Empire wasn't just militarily dominant, it was politically sophisticated, economically powerful through its control of trans-Saharan trade routes, and culturally influential in ways that extended far beyond its borders, making it the kind of neighbor that could demand tribute and expect obedience. And failure to comply meant facing those 100,000 horsemen in open battle, which for a small kingdom on the Abomey Plateau meant almost certain destruction. To the south lay the coastal kingdoms of Alada and Waida,
states that had grown wealthy through their access to European traders who had been present along the African coast since the Portuguese arrived in the 15th century, establishing trade relationships that would grow increasingly complex and morally devastating as the transatlantic slave trade intensified, transforming the entire political and economic landscape of West Africa in ways that would echo through centuries. These coastal kingdoms controlled the ports. They controlled access to European goods, including the firearms that were beginning to change the nature of African warfare. And they controlled the lucrative trade networks that made them wealthy and powerful, creating a situation where the Abomey Plateau found itself geographically and economically isolated, cut off from the coast, unable to access the trade goods that could have strengthened its position, and vulnerable to pressure from all sides. This was the strategic nightmare that King Dakodonu inherited, a kingdom with limited resources, powerful enemies, and terrain that, while offering some defensive advantages, was also limiting. The plateau was good for agriculture, but it wasn't rich. There were no gold mines here, no obvious sources of wealth that could be transformed into military power. And so Dakodonu had to think differently. He had to find ways to leverage what he did have, which was intelligence, determination, and the willingness to try something that no one else had attempted on this scale. The oral histories of the Fon people, the ethnic group that formed the core of Dahomey, contain tantalizing references to what these underground structures might have been designed to achieve. And one story stands out, passed down through generations, about how during invasions by the Oyo Empire, the Dahomean army had this uncanny ability to simply disappear, to vanish from the battlefield as if swallowed by the earth itself, leaving the Oyo cavalry charging at empty air. And then hours or even days later, these warriors would mysteriously reappear behind enemy lines, emerging as if from nowhere to strike at supply lines, command posts, and vulnerable targets before disappearing again into the landscape. Now, for the longest time, historians treated these stories the way they often treat oral traditions that don't fit neatly into Western conceptions of how warfare should work, with a certain skepticism, assuming they were exaggerations, myths designed to make Dahomey seem more formidable than it actually is. But the discovery of Agongionto Zungudo changed that calculation entirely, because suddenly these stories had a physical foundation, a literal underground network that could explain exactly how a force could disappear from one location and reappear somewhere completely unexpected.
Think about what this means from a military perspective. Imagine you're a commander in the Oyo cavalry. You've just led your forces deep into enemy territory. You're confident because you have numerical superiority. You have horses, which give you mobility and striking power that infantry simply cannot match. And you've successfully done this dozens of times before, crushing resistance through the sheer, overwhelming force of mounted warriors charging in formation. You locate what you believe is the main Dahomean force. You position your cavalry for a decisive charge, the kind of maneuver that has won you battles across the region, and then you attack. But as your horsemen thunder forward, something impossible happens. The enemy isn't there. Not exactly. They're not retreating in the traditional sense where you can pursue and cut them down. They're just gone, melted away into the landscape, and you're left in hostile territory, far from your supply lines, surrounded by terrain you don't fully understand. And that's when you start to realize that something is very wrong. Your scouts report movements, but they can't pin down where the enemy actually is. Your supply wagons start getting hit by small raiding parties that strike with precision and then vanish before reinforcements can arrive. You try to consolidate your position, but you can't find a fixed target to engage, and slowly, methodically, your offensive collapses, not because you lost the battle, but because the enemy refused to fight the kind of battle you were prepared to win. This is guerrilla warfare at its most sophisticated, but with a twist that makes it uniquely brilliant. The underground city wasn't just a hiding place, it was a force multiplier that transformed a smaller, less equipped army into something that could challenge a vastly superior opponent by changing the rules of engagement entirely. When archaeologists and historians began studying Agongionto Zungudo after its discovery, they found evidence that supported this interpretation of events. The layout of the underground structures wasn't random. There were clear patterns suggesting military planning. multiple entry and exit points that would allow warriors to emerge at different locations, chambers large enough to hold significant numbers of people, suggesting that entire units could be deployed from underground positions, and interconnected passages that would allow for coordination between different groups, all of which points to a system designed not for passive defense, but for active, offensive operations that use the element of surprise as a primary weapon. But creating something like this required more than just military genius. It required an extraordinary level of social organization and labor, because digging 50 or more chambers 10 meters into the earth, creating stable structures that wouldn't collapse, installing wells that could provide fresh water, and maintaining all of this in secret while also defending against external threats, this is the kind of project that demands thousands of hours of coordinated effort, sophisticated engineering knowledge, and a population that's willing to commit to a vision that might not pay off for years or even decades. The fact that Dahomey was able to accomplish this speaks to something fundamental about the kingdom's character. This wasn't a loosely organized tribal confederation. This was a centralized state with the administrative capacity to mobilize labor, plan large-scale projects, and maintain security around sensitive military installations. And that level of organization would serve Dahomey well in the centuries that followed, as it grew from a small kingdom on the Abomey Plateau into a regional power that would eventually conquer the coastal kingdoms to the south, gaining direct access to European trade and transforming itself into one of the most significant states in West Africa. The underground city represents just one chapter in Dahomey's larger story of resistance and adaptation, because while the tunnels gave them tactical advantages against the Oyo Empire, they couldn't solve all of Dahomey's problems. And by 1730, after years of warfare, Dahomey found itself forced to accept tributary status to Oyo, meaning they had to pay annual tribute in the form of people, goods, and treasure, a humiliating arrangement that lasted for nearly a century and shaped Dahomeyan politics and military development in profound ways. It was during this period of tributary status that Dahomey developed and expanded its most famous military innovation, the Agoji, the all-female warrior regiment that would become legendary across West Africa and beyond. Women who were trained from youth in warfare, who took vows of celibacy while in service, who were considered among the most elite fighters in the kingdom, and who by some accounts numbered up to 6,000 at their peak, making them one of the largest female military forces in recorded history. The creation and expansion of the Agoji wasn't just about military necessity, although that certainly played a role as Dahomey's male population had been depleted by constant warfare and the demands of the slave trade. It was also a reflection of Dahomey's willingness to break with convention when convention wasn't working, to try strategies that other kingdoms would have dismissed as impossible or improper. And this same innovative spirit that led them to build cities underground also led them to arm women and put them on the front lines of battle, creating a force that European observers would compare to the Amazons of Greek mythology, though the Dahomeyans themselves had their own names and their own understanding of what these warriors represented. The Agoji fought in Dahomey's wars of expansion. They participated in slave raids that fed the transatlantic trade and enriched the kingdom's coffers. They defended against invasions and launched invasions of their own, and they developed a reputation for ferocity that made them both feared and respected. European visitors to Dahomey in the 19th century wrote extensively about these warriors, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with horror, but always with a kind of fascinated disbelief that a society would organize military power in this way. By the time King Jizo came to power in 1818, through a coup that deposed his brother with the help of a Brazilian slave trader named Francisco Felix de Sousa, Dahomey had been paying tribute to Oyo for nearly 90 years, and Jizo was determined to end that arrangement, to restore Dahomey's independence and expand its power. And he had advantages that his predecessors lacked. The Oyo Empire was in decline, weakened by internal conflicts and external pressures, and Dahomey had spent decades building its military capabilities, formalizing its army structure, equipping its soldiers with European firearms, and developing the tactical doctrines that would make it formidable. In 1823, Jizo led his forces against Oyo and succeeded where generations had failed. He ended the tributary relationship, he established Dahomey as an independent power, and he set the kingdom on a path of expansion that would continue for decades, conquering neighboring territories, raiding for slaves who would be sold to European traders at coastal ports, and building the wealth and military strength that would make Dahomey one of the most significant states in West Africa during the 19th century. But with that expansion came new challenges and new enemies. Because by the middle of the 19th century, the political landscape of West Africa was changing rapidly. European powers were no longer content to trade at coastal ports, while African kingdoms maintained their independence inland. They were beginning to push for direct colonial control, backed by industrial technology that gave them overwhelming military advantages. And at the same time, the transatlantic slave trade that had enriched Dahomey for generations was coming under pressure from British abolition efforts, forcing the kingdom to adapt its economy while also defending against new threats. One of those threats came from Abeokuta, a Yoruba city that had been founded in 1825 as a refuge for people fleeing slave raids, and which by the 1840s had grown into a formidable power with strong defensive fortifications and access to British weapons and military advisors. When Dahomey attacked Abeokuta in 1851, expecting an easy victory, they instead suffered one of their worst defeats, with casualties numbering in the thousands. And this marked the beginning of a long decline that would eventually culminate in French conquest. The wars between Dahomey and Abeokuta revealed the limits of even the most sophisticated pre-industrial African military systems, because Abeokuta had fortifications that could withstand Dahomeyan attacks. They had artillery that could break Dahomeyan formations, and they had allies, including the British, who provided not just weapons, but also training and intelligence, creating a defensive situation that even the fearsome Aboji couldn't overcome through courage and tactical skill alone. Dahomey would continue to raid Egba territories through the 1860s and beyond, and they would win some engagements and lose others, but the strategic situation was gradually shifting away from them, and by the 1890s, when French forces began their conquest of Dahomey, the kingdom found itself fighting a war it could not win, against an enemy with technologies and resources that made traditional African military advantages irrelevant. The French had artillery that could destroy fortifications from distances that African weapons couldn't match. They had rapid-fire weapons that could cut down charging infantry with devastating efficiency. They had logistic systems that allowed them to maintain large forces in the field indefinitely. And they had the backing of a European industrial power that could replace losses and resupply armies in ways that no African kingdom could hope to match. The final wars between Dahomey and France in the 1890s saw the Agoji fighting with extraordinary courage. These women warriors, who had become symbols of Dahomeyan power, stood their ground against French artillery and machine guns, charging into fire that killed them in waves. And French soldiers who fought against them wrote with a mixture of admiration and horror about their bravery, about how they would continue fighting even after suffering wounds that should have been fatal, about how they showed no fear in the face of technologies designed to inspire terror. But courage alone couldn't overcome the technological gap, and by 1894, Dahomey had fallen to French conquest. King Behanzin, the last independent king of Dahomey, was captured and exiled, and what had been one of West Africa's most powerful kingdoms became a French colony, its military traditions suppressed, its political systems dismantled, and its place in history obscured for generations under the weight of colonial narratives that portrayed African societies as primitive and African resistance as futile. This is where the underground city at Agongantong Zongondo takes on another layer of meaning, because for almost a century after French conquest, these tunnels lay forgotten, sealed off, hidden beneath the earth, while the surface world changed beyond recognition, while Dahomey became part of French West Africa, while independence movements rose in the 20th century,
while the colonial territory that had been called Dahomey gained independence in 1960 as the Republic of Dahomey and then changed its name to Benin in 1975, the tunnels remained undiscovered, a secret that had outlasted the kingdom that built them, a piece of history that survived by virtue of being underground and forgotten. And then in 1998, a bulldozer fell through the earth. Workers discovered chambers that shouldn't exist, and suddenly historians had to reconsider narratives they had been telling about African military history, about resistance to colonialism, about the sophistication of pre-colonial African states. Because here's what the mainstream historical narrative had often suggested, that African kingdoms in the pre-colonial era were relatively simple societies, that they lacked sophisticated military technologies and tactics, that their resistance to European colonization was doomed from the start because they couldn't match European industrial power, and that the conquest of Africa was somehow inevitable because of this technological and organizational gap. The discovery of a Gongantong Zongondo complicates that narrative in important ways, because it demonstrates that African societies were developing sophisticated military technologies and tactics, that they were thinking strategically about problems of defense and offense, that they were willing to undertake massive engineering projects to gain tactical advantages, and that they understood concepts of warfare, including guerrilla tactics, strategic depth, and force multiplication that supposedly primitive societies weren't supposed to understand. The underground city represents a level of military engineering that required advanced understanding of soil mechanics, structural stability, water management, and tactical deployment. This isn't something that gets built by a society that lacks sophistication. This is the product of a state with administrative capacity, technical knowledge, and strategic vision. Just 4 months after the discovery of the tunnels, UNESCO added the site to its tentative list of World Heritage Sites, recognizing that a Gongantong Zongondo represented both a masterpiece of human creative genius and an outstanding example of a type of building that illustrates a significant stage in human history. And archaeologists began the complex work of studying and preserving these structures, trying to understand exactly how they were built, how they were used, and what they can tell us about the kingdom that created them. What they found was fascinating in its complexity. The underground dwellings weren't crude holes in the ground. They were carefully designed spaces with proper structural supports, with smooth walls that had been finished to prevent collapse, with drainage systems to prevent flooding, with ventilation to allow people to breathe during extended stays underground, all of which required not just labor, but specialized knowledge that had to be developed through trial and error over many years. Some chambers contained evidence of multiple levels, suggesting that engineers had figured out how to create stable, multi-story underground structures, a feat that requires understanding stress distribution and load-bearing in ways that aren't immediately obvious. And the presence of wells within the underground complex demonstrates that they had solved the problem of accessing groundwater from deep underground chambers, creating sustainable refuges that didn't depend on surface resources for survival.
The archaeological evidence also suggests that the tunnels were part of a larger defensive network that included surface fortifications, communication systems, and supply caches, creating a layered defense that could respond to different types of threats in different ways. If an enemy arrived with cavalry forces that could overwhelm surface defenses, the population could retreat underground and wait them out. If the enemy brought siege equipment and tried to wait out defenders, the underground wells and storage chambers could sustain people for extended periods. And if the enemy tried to dig them out or smoke them out, the multiple entry and exit points allowed for evacuation or counterattack from unexpected directions. This is the kind of integrated defensive system that you see in highly organized military societies, the kind of thing that requires not just individual genius, but institutional knowledge that gets passed down and refined over generations. But here's what makes this story particularly poignant.
All of this sophistication, all of this innovation, all of this strategic brilliance ultimately couldn't prevent Dahomey's conquest by France, because by the late 19th century, the technological gap between European industrial powers and African pre-industrial societies had grown so vast that no amount of tactical cleverness could overcome it. French forces had weapons that could kill from distances that made traditional African military advantages irrelevant. They had communication technologies that allowed for coordination across vast distances. They had transportation networks that could move troops and supplies with speed and efficiency that African kingdoms couldn't match. And perhaps most importantly, they had the political and economic backing of European empires that could absorb losses and continue fighting indefinitely. The underground city at Agangwainto-Zungudo represents the limits of what pre-industrial military innovation could achieve in the face of industrial military technology. It shows us both the remarkable capabilities of African societies and the brutal reality of technological asymmetry in warfare. Today, the site has been transformed into an archaeological park that's open to visitors, and tourists can descend into some of the chambers, walking through spaces that once sheltered warriors preparing for battle, seeing firsthand the scale and sophistication of what was built here, and considering what it means that this place remained hidden for so long, forgotten by history, until a chance discovery brought it back into view. Tour guides at the site explain the history of the Kingdom of Dahomey. They discuss the military strategies that might have employed these tunnels. They show visitors the intact chambers that demonstrate how people lived underground. And they point out details that reveal the sophistication of the engineering, the way walls were reinforced, the way water was managed, the way spaces were organized for maximum efficiency. But beyond the specific details of this one site, Agangwainto-Zungudo raises larger questions about what we think we know about African history, because for too long, the story of Africa has been told primarily through colonial sources, through the accounts of European explorers and soldiers and administrators who had their own agendas and their own biases, and who often portrayed African societies as primitive and backwards to justify colonial conquest and exploitation. The physical evidence at sites like Agangwainto-Zungudo tells a different story, one of sophisticated societies with complex military and political systems, societies that were responding to real threats with real innovation, societies that had their own historical trajectories before European colonization disrupted everything. And this matters because understanding African history on its own terms, not as a footnote to European expansion, but as a rich and complex story with its own dynamics and its own innovations, is essential for understanding world history more broadly. Because Africa wasn't empty before colonialism. It wasn't stagnant. It wasn't waiting to be discovered and civilized. It was home to kingdoms and empires and states that rose and fell, that competed and cooperated, that developed technologies and tactics and political systems that were sophisticated responses to their specific circumstances. The Kingdom of Dahomey was one of those states, and while it's often remembered today primarily for its role in the slave trade and its eventual conquest by France, the underground city at Agangwainto-Zungudo reminds us that there was much more to this kingdom than its participation in some of history's darkest chapters. The warriors who retreated into these tunnels when Oyo cavalry swept across the Obome Plateau, the engineers who figured out how to create stable structures 10 meters underground without modern tools or materials, the administrators who coordinated the construction and maintained the security of this military installation, the families who lived in these chambers during times of war, waiting for the signal that it was safe to return to the surface or time to emerge and strike at an unsuspecting enemy. All of these people were part of a society that was responding to existential threats with remarkable creativity and determination. They built something that lasted for centuries, that continued to serve its purpose even as the kingdom that created it went through dramatic transformations, that survived conquest and colonialism and independence, that waited underground for someone to rediscover it and recognize its significance. And when that bulldozer fell through the earth in 1998, crashing into a chamber that had been sealed for generations, it opened not just a physical space, but a window into a past that had been hidden.
A reminder that history is full of stories we haven't yet discovered, innovations we haven't yet recognized, achievements we haven't yet appreciated. Because the earth beneath our feet holds secrets that can change how we understand entire civilizations. The underground city at Agangointo Zungudo is one of those secrets, a place that challenges our assumptions about what pre-colonial African societies were capable of, that demonstrates the sophistication of indigenous military engineering, that provides physical evidence for oral traditions that historians once dismissed as legends, and that stands as a monument to human ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds.
There's something deeply moving about standing at the edge of these chambers, looking down into spaces where warriors once prepared for battle, where families once sheltered during invasions, where an entire society once demonstrated its determination to survive by any means necessary, including the monumental task of building a city underground. It's a reminder that throughout history, people have found ways to resist, to adapt, to create solutions to problems that seem insurmountable, and that sometimes the most powerful strategies aren't the ones that rely on superior force, but the ones that change the nature of the game entirely, that transform weaknesses into strengths, that turn the landscape itself into a weapon. The story of Agangointo Zungudu is ultimately a story about resistance and survival, about what people will do when faced with existential threats, about the lengths to which societies will go to protect themselves and maintain their independence, and about the remarkable capabilities that emerge when necessity demands innovation. The kingdom of Dahomey built an underground city not because it was easy, but because the alternative was conquest and subjugation. They developed tactics that allowed them to challenge vastly superior forces not because they were reckless, but because they understood that conventional warfare would lead to certain defeat. And they created military traditions, including the famous Agoji, that broke with established norms, not because they were trying to be different, but because survival demanded using every resource available, including the courage and intelligence of women who other societies would have excluded from military service. These choices, these innovations, these massive undertakings, all emerged from a specific historical context, from a small kingdom on the Abomey Plateau trying to survive in a dangerous neighborhood, trying to carve out space for itself between more powerful neighbors, trying to find ways to turn its limitations into advantages. And while Dahomey ultimately fell to French conquest, while its military traditions were suppressed and its political systems dismantled, while much of its history was obscured or distorted by colonial narratives, the underground city at Agangointo Zungudu survived, waiting beneath the earth for the moment when someone would rediscover it and recognize what it represents. That moment came in 1998 when a bulldozer fell through the earth and revealed chambers that had been hidden for over 300 years. And suddenly, historians and archaeologists and the descendants of the people who built this place had access to physical evidence that could transform our understanding of pre-colonial West African military history. The site has since become a source of pride for Benin, a tangible connection to a past that colonial education systems tried to erase or diminish, a demonstration that African societies were developing sophisticated technologies and tactics long before European contact, and a reminder that the story of Africa is much richer and more complex than the narratives that have dominated for too long. As you stand at this site today, as you descend into chambers that warriors once occupied, as you see the engineering sophistication that went into creating these spaces, you can't help but wonder what other secrets are still hidden beneath the earth, what other innovations are waiting to be discovered, what other stories are waiting to be told.
Because if a construction project in 1998 could accidentally reveal an entire underground city that had been forgotten for over a century, what else is out there, concealed by time and soil and the weight of history? What other evidence of African ingenuity and resistance and adaptation is waiting for someone to stumble upon it and recognize its significance? The underground city at Agongointo Zungudu reminds us that history isn't static, that new discoveries can change established narratives, that the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, and that we should approach the past with humility and curiosity, recognizing that there's always more to learn, always more to discover, always more complexity than the simple stories we tell ourselves. The kingdom of Dahomey was neither simply heroic nor simply villainous. It was a complex society that did remarkable things and terrible things, that showed extraordinary courage and committed horrific acts, that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of military strategy while also participating enthusiastically in the slave trade that devastated millions of lives. And understanding that complexity, holding all of those contradictions in view simultaneously, is essential for understanding African history honestly. The tunnels beneath Agongointo Zungudu don't erase the troubling aspects of Dahomey's history. They don't excuse the kingdom's role in slavery. They don't make conquest by France any less traumatic. But they do demonstrate that African societies were capable of remarkable achievements, that they were thinking strategically about survival and power, that they were developing technologies and tactics that challenged their enemies and preserved their independence for as long as possible, and that when they finally fell to colonial conquest, it wasn't because they were primitive or backwards, but because they were facing opponents with industrial technologies that created insurmountable advantages. And perhaps that's the most important lesson we can take from this site, that understanding the sophistication of pre-colonial African societies makes their conquest by European powers not less significant, but more tragic, because it wasn't the inevitable triumph of civilization over savagery, as colonial narratives suggested. It was the brutal subjugation of complex, capable societies by industrial powers that had temporary technological advantages. And recognizing that distinction is essential for understanding African history and world history more broadly. The underground city at Agongointo Zungudu stands as a testament to human ingenuity, to the remarkable things that people can achieve when survival demands innovation, to the complexity of pre-colonial African history, and to the importance of continuing to search for evidence that can challenge our assumptions and expand our understanding. So the next time you hear simplified narratives about African history, about how European colonization was somehow inevitable, or how pre-colonial African societies lacked sophistication, remember the underground city beneath Agongointo Zungudu. Remember the warriors who vanished into the earth when cavalry approached and reappeared behind enemy lines. Remember the engineers who figured out how to create stable structures 10 meters underground without modern tools. Remember the society that built all of this as a response to existential threats. And ask yourself what other secrets are still hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone to discover them and recognize their significance. Because history is full of surprises, full of innovations that we've forgotten or never knew existed, full of achievements that challenge our assumptions about what was possible in different times and places. And the story of Agongointo Zungudu is just one chapter in a much larger book that we're still learning to read, still learning to appreciate, still learning to understand in all its complexity and contradiction and remarkable human achievement.